RPG developers are often testing the wrong thing. Obviously, I'm not saying QA doesn't matter. Games still need bug testing, performance testing, balance testing, all of that. But RPGs are not just systems, they're experiences. And if you only test whether the systems work without really testing whether the experience holds together, you can still ship a game that technically works, but still leave people disappointed. Take Starfield. A lot of people online got stuck on the loading screens. And sure, sometimes that really was part of the problem. But I don't think people remember those loading screens just because they exist. I think they remember them because the rest of the experience was not landing hard enough. So the loading screens became the symbol of the whole thing feeling chopped up. That's the difference. People don't remember friction by itself. They remember it when the game gives them nothing stronger to hold onto. And disappointment hits harder in an RPG because people are not there just to press buttons. They want to get pulled into a world and feel like their time in it mattered. That's what people remember. And that's why I keep coming back to this idea. Experience assurance testing. Because a lot of RPGs do not fail because one feature is broken. They fail because the overall experience breaks. People stay in an RPG because they get attached. When people talk about RPGs, they usually talk about features. Skill trees, dialogue systems, open worlds, companions, crafting, loot, all of that, sure, it matters. But that's not why people stay with an RPG for 100 or 200 hours or even more. They stay because they get attached. That's the real magic. A good example is Mass Effect 2. Yeah, there's a big threat. Yeah, there's a main mission. Yeah, there's a larger plot hanging over the whole game. But come on. What people really remember is the crew. They remember Liara, they remember Mordin, Garrus, Tali, Legion. They remember the loyalty missions because that's where the game made those characters feel like actual people. That game understood something really important. The story was not just pushing you toward the ending, it was building the ending through relationships. That's why it felt like we shaped the ending. Your choices changed outcomes, they changed who lived and who died. That's what I mean when I say RPGs are experiences. You're not just testing whether dialogue appears on the screen correctly, you're testing whether the player feels connected enough for any of it to matter. Because if that connection isn't there, the whole thing starts falling apart. And that leads to the next problem. Even if a game gets you invested, it still has to nail the ending. This is where RPGs can really hurt themselves, because endings are hard. I say that as a writer. Endings are hard in every medium. They're especially hard in games because players expect their choices to matter all the way through. But hard does not mean disconnected. If I've been with your game for dozens of hours, the ending can't feel disconnected from everything before it. I'm not saying every tiny choice needs its own custom ending cinematic. That's not realistic. But the ending has to feel like it remembers what I did. It has to feel like my playthrough mattered. And when an ending flattens all that into one last-minute choice, players feel it immediately. Not because they're spoiled, because they were invested. For me, Mass Effect 3 is still the clearest example of this. And yes, I know the Citadel DLC did make things a lot better, but still, it's not because the whole game failed. That's exactly why it stings. So much of that game works. You carry that history with you across multiple games. And then the ending feels hollow compared to the road that got you there. That's the kind of thing players do not forget. And what makes this more interesting is that you can also see the opposite version of the problem. With Dragon Age the Veilguard, the strange thing for me was that the ending felt stronger than a lot of the rest of the game. Sharper, more focused, it almost felt like the game suddenly locked in too late. And that creates its own kind of disappointment, because now you're sitting there thinking, wait, where was this energy earlier? Both of those examples point at the same issue. One game builds a huge journey and then gives you an ending that feels flatter than it should. The other gets to the ending and suddenly feels more alive than a lot of what came before it. Either way, the experience is not holding together evenly. And this is one of the places where I think studios test the wrong thing. They'll test whether the ending runs, whether the final quest completes, whether the cutscenes triggers. Okay, great. But who is testing whether it actually lands? Who is testing whether the player walks away feeling satisfied, wrecked, conflicted, whatever the game was going for? That difference matters. Because a weak ending doesn't just hurt the final hour. It changes how people remember everything that came before it. And once that happens, you're not dealing with a technical problem anymore. You're dealing with an experience problem. And endings are only one place where this happens. Sometimes the experience breaks way earlier because the game itself keeps getting in its own way. I think sometimes people talk about bugs in a way that misses the point. Like they're just little technical annoyances, a weird animation, a crash, some NPC doing something stupid in the background. Sure, some bugs are funny, some are harmless. But in an RPG, bugs are not always just technical issues. A bug can ruin the timing of a scene, it can kill tension, it can make the player stop trusting the game. You know that moment when a game finally has you, the character lands, the music lands, and you're in, and then something breaks. An animation bugs out, a line doesn't trigger, a face freezes, the game crashes. That's not just a bug. That's the spell breaking. And once the spell breaks, you're not inside the world anymore. Now you're outside it, looking at the machinery. That matters a lot more in RPGs because immersion is not just a bonus in an RPG. It's part of the structure. And yeah, I know, games are huge now, they're complicated, there will always be bugs. And I know that as a software engineer too. But not all bugs cost the same. A small visual hiccup is not the same as a bug hitting a major quest or a save file. Studios need people whose job is not just to log that something broke, but to say, technically this works, but as an experience, this scene falls apart. That is different feedback. And honestly, it might be the feedback that matters most. Because players do not review games like testers. They review them like players. They remember how the game felt. And that feeling can also get wrecked by something else. Monetization. Let me be careful here. This is not me saying every multiplayer game is bad. And it's not me saying every cosmetic item ruins the art. That's not what I mean. What I mean is this. If your RPG is trying to pull me into a world and then the design keeps reminding me that I'm inside a product, that affects the experience. That friction is real, especially in a single-player RPG. You're asking me to buy into the world and take it seriously. And then suddenly I'm looking at premium currency, a shop, some convenience purchase, some optional thing that still feels like it was baked into the design from the start. That changes the vibe immediately. It reminds me that I'm not just inside a world, I'm inside a monetized system. And again, the spell starts to crack. That's why I think studios sometimes treat monetization like it's only a business issue, when really it's also an experience issue. Even if it's optional, it still changes how I read the game. Do I trust it? Do I stay immersed? Or does it start feeling pushy? And this matters even more in RPGs because RPG players are usually not just there to win, they want to live in that world for a while. So if monetization weakens that feeling, then yeah, it belongs in the conversation too, because it affects the whole experience. And that brings me to the actual point. If all of these things can damage the player's connection to the game, why are studios still so comfortable testing everything in pieces? So here's the idea. I think RPG studios need something that sits next to QA, user research, and everything else they already do. Something wider, something that asks a different question. Not just, does this mechanic work? Does the quest complete? Does the menu behave? Does the cutscene trigger? But does the game actually hold together as a player experience? That's what I mean by experience assurance testing. And no, I don't mean UX. I don't mean just interface stuff. I don't mean balance numbers by themselves. And I don't mean standard QA, even though QA is obviously necessary. I mean people whose job is to look at the whole journey like players. The pacing, the immersion, the way all the parts come together. Because sometimes the problem is not that one thing is broken. Sometimes each individual part works, but together the game still feels off. Maybe the story is strong, but the pacing kills it. Maybe the combat is good, but it steps on emotional moments. Maybe the world is beautiful, but the game keeps breaking the spell. Maybe the ending runs perfectly, but it still feels disconnected from the road that got you there. Those are not just isolated defects, those are experience problems. And yes, I know studios already do playtesting. I know user research exists. I'm not pretending I invented fire here. What I'm saying is that this kind of feedback often doesn't seem to carry enough weight, because players keep running into the same kind of problem. The trust breaks, the immersion breaks, and the payoff doesn't land. That's why I still like giving this a name. Because if you can name the problem clearly, it gets easier to defend the work needed to solve it. The reason I still care about this idea is because it still feels current. Years later, the industry is still way better at fixing games after launch than preventing certain kinds of damage before launch. We still get huge patches, we still get comeback stories, we still get people saying the same thing. Yeah, they fixed it later, but the launch killed it for me. That sentence matters, because first impressions matter, especially in RPGs. An RPG is not just asking for your money, it's asking for your time and your attention. And if a studio messes up that first relationship, some players are just gone. even if the game gets way better later. So no, I'm not saying every game should be delayed forever until it reaches some impossible version of perfection. That's not realistic. And no, experience assurance testing would not magically solve every problem. Obviously not. But I do think more studios need people in the room whose job is to speak for the player's full experience. People who can say, this quest works, but the payoff is weak. Or this feature is technically fine, but it makes the world feel cheaper. Or this monetization may be optional, but it changes how the game feels. Or this ending runs, but it doesn't land. That kind of feedback costs money. Sure, but so does a bad reputation, so does a weak launch, so does losing player trust. If RPG studios want players to fall in love with their worlds, then they can't just test whether the machine runs. They also have to test whether the magic survives contact with the player. And honestly, that might be the test that matters most. RPG studios do not just need better QA, they need better protection for the overall experience. Because players are not judging your game like a spreadsheet of features. They're judging the whole ride. And if that ride breaks, that's what they'll remember long after they forget the patch notes. So maybe the real question is not whether studios can afford this kind of testing. Maybe the real question is, can RPGs really afford not to have it? If you've played an RPG that nailed the full experience or one that completely fell apart by the end, let me know in the comments. Because I think players know this feeling immediately, even if the industry still doesn't really have a clean name for it.